Chapter 3, the second probe, a few months after the first. Cautious probe had whispered its greeting into Martian orbit. Earth sent another. This one did not carry music, mathematics, or images of outstretched hands. It carried an argument. It began on encrypted channels, far from the cooperative glow of the Lunar Council chambers and international assemblies. In a cluster of hardened bunkers carved beneath a windswept plateau, a group of officers, technologists, and ideologues gathered around a holographic model of Sol's inner system. They called themselves the Custodians. To the public, they were a loose coalition of security thinkers, ex-military strategists, and nationalists who hosted popular streams about defending humanity from unknown external threats. In private, they were something sharper, a network determined that no non-human power would ever dictate terms within Earth's sky. On the hologram, Sol Prime, formerly Mars, shone bright and blue-green, its new atmosphere glowing faintly. The Ghemin sphere hung above it like a dark jewel. At the table, a graying man with close-cropped hair and a voice honed by years of command tapped the projection. His name was Briggs. "Look at that," Briggs said. "They turned a dead rock into a garden in less than a generation, and they did it without asking." A younger analyst zoomed in, showing Ghemin settlements, forests, lakes, and glimmering towers. "They answered our probe," the analyst said cautiously. "They acknowledged us, didn't threaten, didn't claim the system." Briggs cut him off. "They acknowledge that we exist," he said. "Not that we have a say, not that we are equals. They are building an entire world up there. Silence plus power is not neutrality, it's dominance by omission. Fear has many tones. Sometimes it murmurs in late-night talk shows. Sometimes it shouts at rallies. Sometimes, like here, it dresses itself in strategy and necessity." Within weeks, the Custodians had diverted funds, persuaded allies, and assembled a plan. A stealth probe, heavily shielded, loaded not with weapons that would be obvious and crude, but with systems designed to pierce and test. It would slip into Sol Prime's orbit under the guise of junk data and outdated launch logs. It would examine the Ghemin settlements with a hostility disguised as assessment. And if it found vulnerabilities, it would quietly map them. Officially, it was never built. Unofficially, it left Earth beneath a classified launch window, its plume buried under scheduled rocket traffic and solar flare noise. To most of humanity, it was invisible. To the Ghemin, eventually, it would be like a pebble thrown into the quiet of a cathedral. Knowing the Ghemin that humanity feared the Ghemin was unsurprising. That humanity knew anything concrete about them was remarkable. For months after the sphere first appeared beside the moon, the Ghemin had remained perfect strangers. No visible windows, no transmissions, no visits, no landings. Conspiracy theories blossomed, then burned out. Artists drew towering silhouettes in murals and digital feeds, borrowing aesthetics from old myth and new Afrofuturist visions. But knowledge did not come from imagination alone. The first clues emerged from the silent visitor's own shadow. In the sphere's early Earth orbit, as it skimmed the planet's magnetic fields, instruments on the ground began to register anomalies, faint repeating signatures in the upper atmosphere, patterns too orderly to be natural phenomena, but too subtle to be deliberate messages. These were the filaments, the invisible threads the Ghemin used to sample biospheres. A group of data scientists in India, cross-collaborating with a French climate lab, noticed that specific sensor arrays near forests and oceans were recording transient ghost codes, bursts of structured interference that looked strangely like layered information requests. They published cautious papers, few noticed at first. Then, in Chile, a telescope specializing in near-Earth objects caught something unusual. A small, faintly reflective shard broke off the surface of the Ghemin sphere, fluttered in a strange spiral, and burned up in the upper atmosphere. During its brief descent, it reflected sunlight in odd ways, encoding scattering patterns that hinted at its material. Within weeks, labs worldwide were running models. What little data they had suggested surfaces that weren't mere metal, but a kind of living alloy, adaptive, responsive, capable of bending electromagnetic fields around itself. The breakthrough came later, through the first cautious probe, the one Amara and Stan helped design. That probe had never approached the sphere directly. Instead, it orbited Earth and then Sol Prime, listening. In the noise of solar wind and atmospheric churn, it found faint echoes, brief, compressed bursts of transmission between Ghemin drones and their settlements. The signals were elegantly encrypted, far beyond human capacity to decode fully. But encryption still rode on carrier waves. Modulation shapes hinted at structure, timing hinted at physiology, from the bursts that correlated with visible Ghemin movements and environmental changes. Humanity began to build a sketch. The Ghemin were tall. Observations from high-resolution orbital imaging showed silhouettes in the settlements, their shadows stretching longer than any humans at comparable angles. Their skin absorbed most incident light and reflected a narrow band at specific angles, giving them a blue shimmer when seen from drone cameras at dawn or dusk. Their atmospheric structures were tuned to different respiratory ratios, high in oxygen, but also optimized for trace gases humans did not rely on. Later, hastily assembled cultural research teams dug into ancient human mythologies, looking for echoes. They found scraps, stories of towering night-skinned figures who walked with lightning in their crowns, legends of 3 sun people who vanished when a star fell from the sky. Oral histories from disparate cultures shared motifs of giants who instructed early humans in agriculture and then disappeared into the heavens. Individually, these stories could mean anything. Together, against the backdrop of an undeniable alien presence, they painted the first fragile portrait. Someone, long ago, before writing solidified, had seen the Ghemin. That realization spread slowly through academic circles first, then into popular media. The name Ghemin itself emerged from 2 sources, a corrupted echo in old Sumerian fragments referencing Ghemin as a fallen world beyond Red Star, and a composite derived from reconstructed patterns in the Ghemin's own internal transmissions. Syllables that repeated in contexts humanity guessed were identifiers, scholars argued over etymology, news anchors simplified. Eventually, public consensus settled. The silent terraformers were Ghemin, and they looked like shadows with a hidden blue sky under their skin. Physiology of a star-walking people. The Ghemin were not simply tall humans. If a human stood beside a Ghemin, the human would see a figure that resembled them only in the broadest outline: limbs, head, torso. But everything else would feel slightly, unsettlingly different. Their height, 8 to 9 feet, was not a strain against gravity, but a comfort in it. Their bones were not hollow like birds, nor solid like humans. Instead, they were lattices of a biocrystalline matrix, interwoven with living alloy threads that grew and adapted over time. This made them both extraordinarily resilient and remarkably light for their size. Their muscles layered in braided cords, capable of subtle micro-adjustments. These allowed Ghemin to handle environments with variable gravity, adapting to Sol Prime's lower pull, to Earth's heavier tug, and to Ghemin's once unique balance without crushing strain. Their skin was the most striking feature. It was black in the way deep space is black, absorbing almost all visible light, but embedded within it were nanoscopic reflective scales tuned to a narrow band of blue wavelengths. When light struck at shallow angles, these scales scattered those wavelengths, creating a shimmer that moved with them like liquid starlight under the skin. This adaptation had served them on Ghemin beneath fierce auroral skies, and on Mars when its sun was pale and stingy. It allowed their bodies to harvest light as energy, supplementing more traditional metabolism, and provided subtle thermal regulation. Their eyes were larger than human, set slightly deeper, with irises that appeared obsidian from a distance, but under close inspection, refracted faint geometric patterns, marks of their cognitive interface with technology. Ghemin neural tissue did not end at the skull. It extended in microscopic conduits through armor and implants, letting them think with and through their environment. Internally, their organs arranged differently, lungs layered in multiple stacks, filtering gases with precision. Their cardiovascular system pulsed not only blood, but also conductive fluids that interfaced with their living alloy implants. Their immune systems had co-evolved with nanotech, comfortable with microscopic machines traveling in their bloodstream. From humanity's perspective, they were both biological and engineered, a species that had long ago decided the boundary between flesh and tool was not a wall but a gradient. The long exile. For 125,000 years, the Ghemin had not been idle. When Ghemin died, their world died with them, but not completely. The fragments drifting between Mars and Jupiter were not just debris. Some carried hardened memory vaults designed to survive impacts in time. In the dawn of their exile, after the great asteroid shattered Ghemin, the surviving fleets did not flee blindly. Their first destination was a constructed refuge, a cluster of massive stations anchored in the Kuiper Belt, far beyond the familiar lights of the inner system. Where sunlight was a weak suggestion and stars crowded closer, there, in cold darkness, the Ghemin rebuilt themselves. They spent centuries decoding the subtle gravitational ripples unleashed by Ghemin's destruction. Those ripples had destabilized Mars, thinned its atmosphere faster than natural progression, and disturbed Earth's climate by delicate degrees. They watched those worlds across light years, mapping the slow consequences of their catastrophe. In the outer reaches, they built new civilizations and floating habitats on captured comets. In hollowed dwarf planets, they explored the Oort cloud like an archipelago, constructing hinterland societies in places humanity had not yet even theorized as anything more than ice and orphaned rock. They did not stay there forever. Driven by both grief and curiosity, Ghemin exploration fleet slipped beyond Sol. They rode gravitational slingshots past Jupiter and Saturn and out into interstellar space, using corridors of bent space-time their living alloy ships could coax and stabilize. They visited a dim red dwarf star where a tidally locked world held a thin strip of twilight habitable belt. They helped a struggling native species adapt, then left when those beings chose isolation. A gas giant whose moons were riddled with ammonia oceans and silicate plateaus. There, they learned new methods of atmospheric tuning, testing them on uninhabited satellites. A trinary system with complex orbital dances, whose planets demanded exquisitely balanced gravitational interventions if they were going to host steady climates. They watched species flame into brief brilliance and then vanish. They witnessed civilizations collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. They stepped in sometimes, but never lightly. The lesson of Ghemin's destruction had carved caution into their cultural bones. Over long millennia, the Ghemin refined a philosophy. To govern is to balance, not to rule. To intervene is to take on debt. To terraform is to accept responsibility for every life that grows under your altered sky. By the time they turned back towards Sol, they were not the same people who had once carved cities across 3 worlds. They were older, slower to claim, more deliberate in action, and wary of being seen as gods, yet the pull of their origin weighed on them. The asteroid belt still sang Ghemin's broken song, and Mars, once held in careful equilibrium, had decayed in their absence. They owed. And so after eons of cold wandering, they folded space and came home. Sol primed the crown of Sol, calling the planet Mars no longer felt accurate, not to the Ghemin, and eventually not even to humans who saw what it had become. To the Ghemin, the transformed world was Sol Prime, the first fully realized example of their matured governance in the system that had birthed them. Sol Prime was not simply blue and green, it was layered. From orbit, its atmosphere appeared thicker than Earth's, with bands of clouds that moved in graceful, predictable currents. A choreography of air tuned to avoid catastrophic storms while still permitting weather rich enough to sustain complexity. On the surface, forests of black-blue trees drank sunlight and converted it with unprecedented efficiency. Their roots communicated electrically as well as chemically, forming bio-networks that fed data back to Ghemin infrastructure. Lakes and seas glowed faintly at night with engineered plankton that regulated temperature and filtered pollutants before they could accumulate. Cities rose in arcs and spires that seemed grown rather than built. Their foundations extended deep, anchoring into tension-stabilized crusts that redistributed tectonic stresses across the globe. This made quakes rare and gentle, spreading instead like slow breaths through the mantle. Within the cities, Ghemin used energy systems that barely radiated waste heat. Power flowed along resonant conduits tuned to planetary frequency, minimizing leakage and maximizing harmony with Sol Prime's magnetic field. From a technological standpoint, Sol Prime surpassed Earth on multiple fronts. Its planetary defense grid could deflect large asteroids through subtle cumulative pushes instead of brute impacts. Its climate control systems worked at an integrated scale, embedding regulation in ecosystems rather than relying on mechanical interventions alone. Its data networks were literally woven into living structures, making every tree, every street, every stream part of a distributed sensing and thinking system. Yet the Ghemin did not see Sol Prime as a monument to their superiority. They saw it as a repaired promise, a world brought back from neglect, tuned not just for themselves, but for any future visitors who could walk its soil without burning or freezing. They knew humans would come eventually. They were building with that in mind. Fear in the shadow of greatness. Back on Earth, none of this felt reassuring. Ordinary people saw Sol Prime's transformation in their skies and on their screens and felt wonder first, then a creeping unease. It was one thing to know there was life beyond Earth in abstract. It was quite another to watch that life remake a nearby planet into something breathtakingly advanced while saying as little as possible. Fear is an old habit. Histories of war and colonization weighed heavily on human minds. Many drew parallels, some accurate, some stretched, between the Ghemin and past empires. They remembered how powerful newcomers had once arrived on distant shores, bearing technology and promises, only to leave extraction and ruin behind. "We are not going to be someone's wilderness," Briggs told his custodians. "We are not a background species in someone else's epic." He believed every action the Ghemin took was a potential prelude to control. The fact that the Ghemin had not openly interfered with Earth's climate, satellites, or military networks did not comfort him. In his mind, power without overt use was simply delayed use. For many others, the fear was less organized but just as deep. Late-night anxiety about children growing up in a system where humans were no longer unquestionably dominant. A sense that decisions affecting entire worlds were being made in places humanity could not see, by beings humanity did not understand. That fear, given time, always produces actors willing to do something. The second probe was that something. The hostile probe, unlike the first diplomatic probe, this one carried no invitation. No encoded friendly greetings. Its mission profile was stark. Approach Sol Prime along a trajectory masked by predictable solar noise. Drift into orbit at an altitude just above Ghemin traffic lanes. And you perform deep scans of Ghemin infrastructure, focusing on energy sources, defense grids, and what the Custodians feared might be planet-spanning weapons. Test Ghemin response times with controlled electromagnetic pulses, small enough to seem like natural fluctuations, precise enough to reveal detection thresholds. A kill switch sat embedded in its core. If the probe detected direct attempts to breach its systems, it would scramble its own memory and tumble into Sol Prime's upper atmosphere, burning to ash. Briggs had argued for something harsher, viral code that could seek Ghemin networks. Others pushed back, warning that any digital intrusion would be suicide if the Ghemin noticed. In the end, the probe carried teeth only in the sense that it was intrusive, not overtly destructive. But intent matters. Human hands had built it with suspicion as the primary fuel. Ghemin noticed when the second probe slipped into Sol Prime's orbit, it thought it was clever. Its body was wrapped in stealth material meant to absorb most visible and infrared light, its emissions masked, its movement a quiet glide along predictable vectors, its scans unfolded in slow, low-amplitude sweeps, trying to look like background noise. On Sol Prime, Ghemin planetary systems registered it almost immediately. In the central control vault, a cavernous space beneath a primary city where data from every route, branch, wave, and wind converged, Liru watched an anomaly appear on a shared model of the sky. It was small, dark, and unnecessarily cautious. "This one is different," Liru said to Sael and Voru as they joined him. "No greeting, no open signal. It watches like a thief at the window." Sael studied its path. "They have factions," she said softly. "Curiosity and cooperation in one hand, fear and control in the other." Voru traced the probe's scan pattern, seeing how it lingered on energy grids. "Settlements, atmospheric regulators. They fear what they do not understand," he said. "They build a story where power must be threat because power could be threat." He touched a control surface. Data responded. "We could dismantle it from here," Liru noted. "Unravel its systems, drop it into the sea, leave them wondering what went wrong with their launch." Sael considered the option. "It would be easy. Sol Prime's defenses could pluck the probe like a seed from the wind." "No," she said, "not yet. Let it look. Let it see the surface of what we have made. Their fear is not entirely irrational. We are large. We are old. We have moved worlds. If we want them to grow beyond fear, we must allow them to confront us without immediate punishment." Voru frowned. "And if their probing turns to intrusion, then we will remind them," Sael replied, "that our patience is not infinite." She turned away from the model of the probe and looked down at Sol Prime's expanding forests and gleaming cities. "A technologically advanced world invites envy, awe, and hostility," she said. "We built Sol Prime to be a place of balance, not provocation. That means we must balance even their aggression, time debt, and the shape of things to come." As months passed, the hostile probe continued its quiet work, feeding encrypted findings back toward Earth with each orbit. On the ground, humans saw none of this directly. They felt only distant ripples, rumors of deep intelligence missions, anonymous leaks hinting that we know more than we're telling, commentators claiming that back-channel sources had confirmed Ghemin vulnerabilities, or conversely, Ghemin invincibility. In truth, The probe's data painted a more complicated picture. It revealed planetary systems of staggering sophistication, yes, but also contexts that did not align with overt militarization. It saw the flow of power across Sol Prime, but mostly into life support structures, environmental regulation, and city growth. It logged patterns that looked like defensive postures around incoming space debris, but none that looked like weapons aimed at Earth or the moon. To ideologues like Briggs, even this nuance was unacceptable. "They're capable," he would say, voice hard. To his inner circle, capability precedes intent. History teaches us that. History had taught the Ghemin something else. From their perspective, Earth's journey, from stone tools under changing skies to moon base and interplanetary probes, had been a remarkable sprint. In 125,000 years, humans had done what many species failed to do: survive their own power long enough to look outward with more than hunger. That alone made humanity worth the caution. The Ghemin remembered their tri-world era, Ghemin, Mars. Earth woven into a delicate cloth of influence, gravity, and seasonal management. They remembered how their departure had left humans alone with planetary forces they did not yet understand. They remembered the asteroid belt singing their failure. Now, as Sol Prime rose to become the most technologically advanced world in the system, the Ghemin faced a new subtle problem. They had brought one planet into careful harmony. Another planet, Earth, remained profoundly out of balance, politically, ecologically, culturally, but fiercely alive. Between them, moons, belts, and lesser bodies circled. They could not govern all without repeating old mistakes. They could not withdraw entirely without dishonoring debts. Sol Prime's new name, in Ghemin tongues, carried not just pride, but obligation. It was the Prime not in dominance, but in responsibility, the primary anchor of balance in Sol. As they watched human probes, friendly, socially, and hostile, skate along their skies, they knew the era of silent separation was ending. Words sooner or later would have to follow, but before that, they needed to understand their neighbors just as thoroughly as Earth now struggled to understand them, their physiology, their history, their fears. And on Earth, in a small neighborhood in Houston and in the halls of a lunar base, people like Stan and Amara found themselves at the strange crossroads where local governance and cosmic diplomacy met. The Ghemin had turned Mars into Sol Prime. Humanity had turned fear and wonder into questions and plans. And sometimes dangerous tests. The next step for both would determine whether the inner system became a shared neighborhood or a contested frontier. On Sol Prime, the Ghemin finally stepped out of the long shadow of exile and into a world they could call home again. For the first time in 125,000 years, peace was not a memory. They could feel it under their feet. 10 million souls descend. When the great ship slid lower in Sol Prime's sky, it was like a second dawn. Its round, gleaming hull had once been a distant silhouette above oceans of rust. Now, as the atmosphere thickened and clouds softened the sun's glare, the vessel sank through layers of blue until it hovered just above new-grown forests and nascent cities. For weeks, the Ghemin prepared. Inside the ship's caverns, families gathered in departure halls. The halls themselves were works of art, vaulted ceilings of living alloy etched with swirling patterns that responded to those who passed beneath them. Every etching represented a fragment of Ghemin history: Ghemin's lost auroras, Mars's ancient ice seas, Earth's young jungles, the distant twilight worlds they had visited. 10 million Ghemin souls had survived the long wander. 10 million now stood on the threshold of Sol Prime. They did not rush. In Ghemin culture, arrival was not a moment but a ceremony. Elders traced protective glyphs on doorways. Children placed small, bioluminescent stones in niches along corridors as light seeds to guide returning spirits. Songs, sung in low harmonies that resonated through the ship's structure, filled the air. Then, in ordered waves, they descended. Some rode in slender transport spires that dropped like falling spears and unfolded into petals upon landing. Others walked down bridges grown from the ship's own hull, bridges that extended until they touched newly built platforms on the ground. A few glided in living gliders, organic tech wings that drank the wind and rode it gently down. When their feet touched Sol Prime's soil, many knelt, pressing their hands into the dark, fertile ground. The soil responded to their touch with faint pulses of light. A welcome coded into planetary systems. They were home, not on Ghemin, but on a world that carried Ghemin's philosophy in its very climate. Ghemin governance, balance as law. The Ghemin did not think of governance as something apart from daily life. For them, governing was as woven into existence as breathing on Sol Prime. Their governance structure followed 3 interlocking principles. 1. Circles of stewardship. Ghemin cities and regions were organized into circles, each responsible for a particular aspect of planetary balance: water, air, soil, energy, memory, and culture. Members of a circle were called stewards, and they rotated roles over time so that no one spent their entire life in a single concern, preventing narrowness. 2. Council of Resonance. Above the circles, there existed a planetary council, the Resonant Council, made up of representatives chosen not only for wisdom, but for how their decisions resonated with lived reality. Metrics of resonance included ecological stability, social contentment, creative output, and the absence of systemic suffering. It was not enough that a policy worked on paper, it had to hum in harmony with the world. 3. Covenant of Debt. The Ghemin held a formal covenant acknowledging the debts they carried. To Ghemin, the shattered world. To Mars, neglected and restored. To Earth, affected by their past gravitational missteps. All major decisions were weighed against this covenant. If an action increased debt, it was suspect. If it repaid debt by stabilizing, healing, or preserving, it was favored. In practice, this meant that Ghemin governance rarely issued rigid decrees about everyday life. Instead, it set constraints and obligations. No city could grow beyond the capacity of nearby ecosystems to support it without external strain. And energy use had to align with planetary rhythms. Spikes were permitted only for emergencies. Any technological development had to pass through a review not only of safety, but of relationship. What new dependencies it created, what old skills it threatened, what narratives it encouraged. There were no elections in the human sense. Instead, Ghemin used selection by contribution, those whose work visibly improved balance through art, science, mediation, or care were invited into higher circles. Service was honor, not ambition. They believed that the healthiest governance was one where people felt the law as an extension of the world's health, not as an external weight. Art, memory made visible. Ghemin art was not an ornament, it was infrastructure. Every building, every bridge, every public space carried layered stories in its design. In the central city of Sol Prime, whose heart lay nestled in a vast crater now filled with terraced gardens and lakes, the main plaza was a living gallery. Towering arches rose around it, each etched with scenes from Ghemin's long journey. One arch depicted Ghemin under 3 suns, standing on Ghemin's mountain ridges, their silhouettes black-blue against aurora. Another showed the moment of destruction, the asteroid streaking in, the planet cracking, cities folding, and a third captured their exile, ships gliding through the cold outer dark, tiny against distant stars. A fourth showed worlds they had visited, stylized and abstract, symbols of lessons learned. In the plaza's center grew a memory tree, its trunk a seamless fusion of living wood and alloy. Panels along its bark shifted periodically, projecting ghostly images of Ghemin ancestors, their voices recounting stories in low melodic tones. Children sat around its roots, listening. Ghemin music, too, carried function. They used sound not just for emotional expression, but for micro-tuning space. Public performances would resonate at frequencies that subtly reinforced structural integrity in nearby buildings, or stabilized atmospheric flows over a city. A festival might leave behind not just memories, but a physically calmer sky. Visual art extended into clothing. Armor and robes bristled with intricate patterns, nested spirals, intersecting lines that changed slowly throughout the day, reflecting planetary conditions. By glancing at another's attire, a Ghemin could read the local temperature trends, soil vitality, or even subtle morale metrics in their region. For them, art was a way of teaching everyone to see the world's health at a glance. Love and family. Despite their towering stature and complex tech, Ghemin families were tender in ways that would have looked familiar to humans. In Ghemin language, the word for child translated loosely as small future, a being in whom the world's next balance would reside. Children were not shielded from knowledge of Ghemin's past. From a young age, they learned stories of Ghemin's destruction and exile, not to frighten them, but to instill humility. A typical Ghemin household consisted of extended kin, elders, adults, adolescents, and young children living in interconnected chambers grown from living material. Rooms could open or close, expand or contract, according to need. Privacy was respected, but rarely absolute. Much of life unfolded in shared spaces. Expressions of love were subtle, but rich. Parents would trace gentle light patterns along their children's arms, activating embedded sensors that produce soft warmth and color, a tactile reassurance. A partner shared resonance sessions, sitting in close physical contact while their neural implants synchronized to produce shared dreamlike experiences. Family meals were held around nutrient pools and communal tables where food arrived via grown conduits, fresh and tailored to each body's needs. Romantic bonding, for Ghemin, was both emotional and resonant. Compatibility was assessed not only in affection, but in how two individuals' cognitive and energetic patterns harmonized. Long-term partners often wore linked ornaments, bands of living alloy that shimmered in similar rhythms. Despite their long lifespans, Ghemin understood loss intimately. They had lost a world. They had watched friends and kin die in the void, on harsh stations, on experimental habitats. This made their love both cautious and fiercely protective. On Sol Prime, many families chose to plant remembrance gardens, small plots where they grew plants derived from Ghemin's old ecosystems. Each plant represented someone absent. Children watered them, learning that memory needed constant care. Education, teaching balance. Ghemin education was less about memorizing facts and more about learning how to feel systems. Children began formal learning early, but there were no rigid schools separated from community. Instead, education centers were integrated into neighborhoods, open halls where elders, stewards, and specialists offered guided experiences. A Ghemin child might spend a morning watching how a change in wind pattern altered the tone of outdoor chimes, then mapping those changes to atmospheric data. Sitting at a console that let them tune miniature environments, raising or lowering temperature, adjusting light, then observing how simulated plants and microbes responded. Listening to recordings from distant worlds the Ghemin had visited, comparing those ecosystems to Sol Prime's. They learned mathematics, physics, biology, ethics, and history, but always with the same underlying question: if you touch the world here, what happens there? Curricula were personalized via neural interfaces that could sense how each child processed information. Some learned best through music, others through spatial puzzles, others through narrative. The system adjusted, but expectations remained high. Every Ghemin was expected to understand the basics of planetary balance by adolescence. Advanced students entered apprenticeships with stewards, helping monitor regional health metrics, participating in small governance decisions, debating trade-offs in council simulations. Failure in Ghemin culture was not punished but analyzed. When a student made a poor decision in simulation, they were encouraged to trace the consequences fully, then design a repair. They grew up knowing that mistakes were inevitable, but unacknowledged mistakes were unacceptable. Building lives on Sol Prime, as the 10 million Ghemin disembarked, Sol Prime shifted from project to home. They spread across continents newly sculpted, along vast river valleys. They built terraced farms where engineered crops grew in layered fields, each stratum tuned to different nutrients and light exposures. On gently sloping plains, they erected domed livestock habitats where animals, some native to Ghemin's past, some hybridized from Earth genomes, grazed under controlled skies. Their agriculture was 100 times more efficient than Earth's, not because they exploited the land harder, but because they collaborated with it more deeply. In a single stacked farm tower, thousands of crop varieties grew at once. Grains, fruits, medicinal plants, each floor tuned to a specific microclimate. Nutrients cycled in closed loops. Waste was reprocessed at molecular levels. No soil was exhausted. No aquifer overdrawn. Livestock were not kept in crowded misery. Ghemin saw animal suffering as a destabilizing factor. Herds moved through simulated biomes that were rich and stimulating. Their health monitored in real time by embedded sensors and microbial companionships. Communities formed around these centers of production. Neighborhoods on Sol Prime were designed to ensure that everyone lived within walking distance of a learning hall for ongoing education, a resonance hub where local governance circles met and data about the region's health flowed. He did a sanctuary space, a quiet zone for reflection, song, and art. Green quarters, where wild biodiversity could thrive without human intrusion but still be observed respectfully. Technology hummed quietly everywhere, in walls that adjusted transparency based on sun angle, in streets that flexed to absorb seismic microshocks, in air filters that used living membranes instead of mechanical fans. Yet nothing felt harsh or sterile. To a Ghemin, Sol Prime's technology was simply the skeleton under a living body, present, essential, but rarely ostentatious. Love of Sol Prime and the future. They see the Ghemin loved Sol Prime with a depth that surprised even themselves. They had always been a people of worlds, of Ghemin, of ancient Mars, of early Earth. But after so much time drifting among stars, being a guest or a caretaker or a restrained ally, they had not realized how much they yearned for a place that answered them back. Sol Prime did. Every dawn, as the pale sun rose and lit the blue and green patches, the atmosphere carried subtle tones, engineered but gentle, that resonated with Ghemin neural implants. It was a planetary greeting, a low whisper of, "You are here, and I am well." Elders who had watched Ghemin die wept quietly at first. Children born in exile stations laughed openly, racing along routes and pathways, their elongated strides kicking up rich, fragrant soil. In their councils, Ghemin spoke often of future peace. Peace, to them, did not mean absence of conflict. It meant an enduring framework in which conflicts did not spiral into systemic harm. They envisioned generations of Ghemin growing up without the constant backdrop of survival calculations. Its collaborative projects with other species, perhaps including humans, where shared stewardship would extend beyond one planet. A gradual reduction in the Covenant of Debt's burden as repaired worlds and stabilized systems accumulated. Prosperity, in their definition, was not hoarded wealth but expanded balance. More beings thriving with less extraction, more creative output with less waste. Growth did not mean infinite expansion, it meant deepening, more layers of meaning, more sophisticated understanding, more nuanced relationships. They had built Sol Prime to be the blueprint of that future, for the 10 million Ghemin who now walked its forests, tended its farms, and sang in its plazas. The world was both promise and responsibility. They knew humanity watched from afar. They understood Earth's fear and curiosity. They did not yet invite humans in, but they did not design Sol Prime only for themselves. Black-blue trees along high ridges bore fruit engineered to nourish bodies with slightly different chemistry. Lakes had shorelines where gravity felt comfortable to being shorter and denser than Ghemin. Learning halls stored not only Ghemin history, but simulations tailored for minds that thought in different patterns. Sol Prime was the Ghemin's crown, but it was not meant to be their fortress. It was meant to be a shared axis one day. For now though, as hostile and friendly probes circled, as human factions argued on Earth and Moon, the Ghemin focused inward, on raising their children in a world that would not crumble, on weaving their art into the bones of a planet, on refining a governance structure that could hold not only them, but someday others. They were building peace where they stood, even as the universe beyond remained uncertain. The hostile probe crossed the line on a quiet afternoon. Sol Prime's sky was a soft, diluted blue, clouds tracing slow curls over black-blue forests and silver cities. Children played along terrace gardens, their laughter mixing with the low hum of resonance music drifting from public plazas. In the central crater city, the memory tree pulsed faint light as elders told stories of Ghemin's long journey. The planet felt steady, balanced, safe. Then in the vault beneath the city, the world flinched. When patience meets pressure in the resonance vaults, where data from every root, wave, and breeze converged, Liru stood before a vast projection of Sol Prime's sky. Filaments of light represented orbital paths, Ghemin transports, atmospheric regulators, monitoring spines. He was reviewing routine flow when a new line appeared, sharp, flickering. "Wrong, anomaly," he murmured. The line was the hostile Earth probe, but now its behavior had shifted. For months it had flown softly, mimicking noise, grazing the edges of Ghemin systems without disturbance. Ghemin watchers had let it look, confident in their ability to absorb curiosity without harm. Today, curiosity had turned to intrusion. "What changed?" Sael asked as she entered the vault, the light catching her crown, turning its intricate silver into cold fire. Liru expanded the anomaly's profile. The probe's scans had narrowed, concentrating on a key node of Sol Prime's planetary grid, a cluster of resonance towers that balanced regional energy and magnetic flows. Worse, the probe had begun to emit directed pulses, focused disruptions intended to test how much interference the towers could withstand. "It's probing our spine," Liru said calmly, though the vault's ambient tone had dropped half a pitch, a subtle sign of planetary stress. Voru joined them, eyes flicking over the data. "If it destabilizes that node even slightly," he said, "the local climate will wobble, not catastrophically, but enough to ripple. This is no longer observation, it is pressure." Sael watched the pulses plot across the projection, each one like a tiny hammer strike against the world's skeleton. "Their fear grows teeth," she said softly. "We hoped they would restrain themselves.